So we're going to talk about defining high conflict. And yesterday, Kyle and I sat with our favorite high conflict couple who we have been seeing for a long time. And after every session, we wonder, why do they keep coming back? We have many times had to ask them to stop screaming because our neighbors in the other offices get annoyed. They scream so much at each other. But we are making tiny bits of progress with them and with all of our families. So one of the things that is really clear is that we all define high conflict in very different ways. We know what high conflict is. If you work in this field and I say it's a high conflict couple, you know what I mean. But how do we actually operationalize that so that we can try and change it in a systematic way, so that we can talk to each other in a language that we both understand? So when we define, isn't this supposed to turn? Ah, there you go. No. I checked it before and it was working. Ah, it works. Instead of turning it here, I have to turn it over here. See? Doot, doot. Okay? Clever intervention. I thought out of the box, and it worked. So when we define high conflict, we're talking about high levels of distrust and anger, a willingness to engage in repetitive litigation, even though it is extremely stressful. And most of the people who are engaging in it recognize that it is not only harmful to them, but harmful to their families. There are often domestic violence issues and discussion these days of one parent's alienation. I used to believe, being a family systems person, that you cannot, it takes two to tango. But I don't think that's true anymore. I think conflict can be unilateral. It can be disengaged from, but with great effort. And it is much easier for one person to keep conflict going than it is to disengage from it when the other person is just determined to keep it going. So conflict can be perpetuated mostly by one person. We are talking about, when we talk about conflict, of course, we're talking about the duration of conflict, and we're talking about the intensity of it. And I put a definition by Cummings and Davies that I still think is one of the clearer definitions that is in the field, even though it is very old. But what's most useful to me is to think about conflict in terms of low, medium, and high. When it's low conflict, it's about solving problems. There's usually issues that come to the forefront that need to be dealt with. And there tends to be a hopeful emotional climate. This is difficult, but we can figure this out. Medium conflict couples carry over interactions from their families of origin. They continue to act in ways often that they are unaware of what's happening or of why they continue to respond in the way that they do. There's much higher blame, and there's great reactivity, sort of an immediate flare-up, an over-responsiveness to the negative aspects and disagreements. And the relationship is viewed as the problem. So there's not a problem to solve. The problem is you. And the problem is that we are a problem. That usually, by the time the conflict is at that level, the couple is coming to see you if you're a mental health person, or they may be already in the courts because they have decided the relationship is not viable. The high conflict couple it's chronic, it's very high reactivity. There's no sense of responsibility. It's never my fault or my contribution. It's always that the other person is just, pardon my French, an asshole. There's a constant fight-flight response. That is, one person wants to fight and the other one pulls away in ways that create a sense of insecurity that gets the first person to keep pushing. And everything becomes a contest. There's going to be a winner and a loser, and the emotional climate is hopelessness, rage, and revenge. That often comes with a direct narcissistic injury to one person where it is so painful psychologically that they cannot get past what they need to do to sort of hurt the other person back. I think that's very much the case with this couple I was talking about. What defines high conflict then is the pattern, the content matter, and the intensity. You have to look at all three areas. And there are core clusters that are often helpful, again, to think about this. One core cluster in conflict is the pervasive negative exchanges. That is constant aggression, defensiveness, and dualistic thinking. You're the villain, I'm the victim. And the VV, as I call it, the villain and victim are always represented. There's also a hostile, insecure emotional environment, and this is what's so toxic to children. It's not just that parents fight, but that they create an environment around the conflict where everybody who comes in range, it's like you step into the force field and everything is insecure and uncertain and hostile. And one of the defining characteristics of this cluster is that other people get brought in. Certainly children, but also attorneys and therapists and school personnel. I'm working with a case in New York right now where they are going to bring in the nanny, and that happens so often. The nanny gets triangulated and pulled into both sides and becomes the person who is going to validate each person's experience. I also talked a lot about the emotional reactivity and mutual distrust. We know from research that early divorces that happen very quickly, are usually predicted by high levels of negative affect. That is, if couples tend to have a lot of negative affect about and with each other, I think Gottman said there's about a 70 to 80% chance that you can actually predict the divorce and that it will happen soon. On the other hand, marriages that last much longer and still end up in divorce are predicted not so much by that negative affect, because that requires a quicker solution, but low levels of positive affect. Over time, there's no warmth, there's no validation, there's no sense that I'm better with you and that I make you feel good and you help me. So that predicts divorce later in life when kids are older. The common pattern of interaction in both of these scenarios is demand and withdrawal. That is, I expect you to do things, I demand you to do them, I'm impolite or unkind or over expectant, and you respond by stonewalling, leaving, doing anything that makes me more insecure and more likely to continue demanding. We learned years ago from Gottman and Levinson's research that there are physiological reasons why men leave conflicts quicker and earlier than women do. When there's conflict, their physiology, their heart rate, and their respiration rate goes up quicker and stays up longer. and that by leaving the conflict, by exit, sorry, I hope no one felt that. By exiting the room, they give themselves time for their physiological affect and to regulate themselves and to come back to normal. Interestingly, women's physiology doesn't respond in the same way. So it's easier for women to become the pursuers because they actually get more relief by talking about it and having it get resolved, while the men get more relief by waiting until their heart rate returns to normal and they feel like it's not pounding in their head, that they don't feel their pulse pounding. So that sets up a common couples dynamic that we often see. It's helpful to allow couples to understand the research, the empirical reason for this, and then to help them find ways in which both of them can get their needs met, both emotionally and physiologically. Jan Johnston talked about 3 dimensions of conflict. So what I'm doing is sharing different models with you. Oops, sorry about that. Now you're caught up. Jan talked about the domain of the conflict, which is the content, the tactic. Does someone use aggression, avoidance, or coercion? Those are the 3 main tactics. And then what are the attitudes? What is the degree of negativity? Much negativity is overt, but a lot of it is covert. And so you only really understand it. We often talk about passive aggressiveness. This drives a partner crazy, but it's much harder to pin down. When they are in my office presenting, the passive-aggressive person seems very reasonable, very giving. I can't quite figure out why the partner is making such a fuss, but what they get at home is very different. The main question for intervention, when you're deciding what should happen with the child in this situation, is what can the child tolerate and make good use of? And what can the more abusive or hostile parent offer the child? That's how you decide, not this is a high conflict couple, so this child should never see her father, or this child should never be around both parents at the same time. That's too simplistic for all the reasons I just gave, because the conflict could be covert, because the many ways that it gets manifested makes it difficult to figure out what you could do that would make the conflict stop for the child. So the question is the child at risk for abuse or neglect? What is the child's capacity to use counseling? Can they get enough help to understand what's happening in their family, that they can have contact with both parents, and they can preserve their soul and what they need to do to maintain, to stay on course developmentally? What type of treatment is needed at the same time that we're working with a high conflict couple? Does one parent need to be on medication? Are there substance abuse issues? And what safeguards can be put in place? Could there be supervised access? Could there be a suspension of overnights? Could there be more frequent, shorter visits? Is there a way to prevent transitions where the parents have contact with each other? To the extent these questions can be resolved, we have possibilities for, in high conflict situations, for allowing the child to have a relationship with both parents. And often that reduces the conflict, because one of the sources of conflict is one or both parents' total fear of losing the child or of being cut out. So if we can do this without cutting them out, that often reduces the conflict in a fairly short time. Jaffe, one of your countrymen, suggests 5 types of interpersonal violence, and these get caught up with high conflict couples. So the first type is abusive, controlling violence. Oops, sorry, I will get this. There we go. The first type is abusive and controlling violence. That's what we talk about when we talk about the batterer, intimate terrorism. It's totally about domination. The second type that's more often seen in divorce situations is conflict-instigated violence. This is also known as situational violence, and it's sometimes called common couple violence. It's perpetrated by both couples, both partners, because they have such limited problem-solving skills that they resort to conflict. And it's often found in community samples. That is, people who are not necessarily in therapy or in the courts, but who just continue together despite the fact that they're almost always coming to blows with each other. The violent resistant strain is when one partner uses violence in response to abuse by the other. And you see this less in community samples and more in shelter samples. This is why when we see data about how widespread is violence, and the data often are very discrepant. One reason is because dependent on the sample that's selected, you see very different answers. So if you look at a community sample, you get one kind of violence and one level of, one, not level, but what's the word I'm looking for? Incidence. On the other hand, if you look in a shelter group, almost everybody is going to report high violence. It's used in self-defense. It's trauma-induced. That is, it's often a traumatic, impulsive response. That is, I can't take this anymore. And it is the burning bed response, if you've seen that film. And then there's separation-instigated violence. In some ways, this is less frightening for couples because it hasn't pervaded their entire relationship. But it also means that people can be at their highest risk at the time of separation. So these are acts by one or both partners at the moment of, I'm about to lose you, and this hits me so deeply that I just lash out in some way. It may have only happened once. That doesn't make it less serious. Sometimes that once is enough, as you may probably know. Women are most likely to be killed at the time of separation. Who initiates high conflict? Well, we often talk about parents, but I just want to point out that attorneys are some of the great contributors to conflict. Mental health professionals also. I have so many stories from families where they come in and mom tells her therapist the story of what's happening at home, and without knowing the other side or ever meeting the father, the therapist says, that is horrible, you have to leave him. They jump in to help without having a good systems perspective. And so the therapist winds up supporting one side of the ambivalence. And the best way to sort this out psychologically is to support both sides of the ambivalence until the person is ready to come down on one side or the other. And that can take a very long time, often years. The court system, of course, also contributes. One of the things that happens in courts is that there are so many untrained professionals in the courts. There are judges whose main introduction to family law is that they were parents, and so they know everything through their own family eyes. There are mental health professionals and others who are not well paid and who therefore are often not as highly trained. There are extensive delays in the court, and that creates conflict. Kyle and I often say that the greatest witness in a family is time, and that if you let enough time go by, really that is the corroborating evidence. My research shows that except at the extremes, parents who never see their child, who get to see them finally, you can go through a whole long evaluation, and if it takes long enough, 99% of the time, it supports the status quo. So why do it? That's another presentation. But I have to get that in there because I have come to be very skeptical about the extensive use of evaluations. I believe they're very important in some cases when we're protecting children and we need to figure out what is the level of substance abuse, what is the level of potential violence. But to do an extensive evaluation, to decide whether there should be an extra overnight, really? And I don't know what your style is here in Quebec, but I work in Toronto a lot and in Alberta a lot. And certainly in Ontario, they do too many evaluations. It's important to also think about the correlates of high conflict: substance abuse, domestic violence, child abuse and neglect, mental health issues, including personality disorders, cultural conflicts, religious, racial, and family culture, relocations, abductions, alienations. These are all part and parcel of the high conflict family. So this is much more writing than you can see easily, but I wanted you to have the list. I know you have it on your slides. I don't usually give slides with so much writing, but I was aware that it was all being translated, so I was trying to make it simple. These are the kinds of things that you actually see. This is how the high conflict gets operationalized in access cases. So one of the biggest areas is step-up plans, and my colleagues and I have now developed a chart that helps you figure out, it's a model for whether you should step up the time and access with one parent. So if you have not seen that, it's in Leslie Dro's and Michael Saney's book, Custody Evaluations, but it's also, I can give it to you, it's on the website. It's on my website. I'm not sure if it's on my website, but I can send you a PDF that helps you walk through and decide, should we up the access? Late exchanges, pick up and drop offs. I won't go through the whole list, but these are the issues that get introduced that become part and parcel of what you will hear and what you have to resolve for high conflict families. Before I turn to the next slide, I'm now going to share some of the tools that I've been part of developing to create new models for both figuring out who's high conflict and figuring out how to help them. Why use tools? I've done an overnights chart now, and I've done a step-up chart, and as you'll see, I have tools for here. I'm very interested in the translation of science. I think there's absolutely no reason to be in this field if the only people who use it are the other people in the field. It should be in the hands of interdisciplinary professionals and the families who need it. So when we make tools, it helps us operationalize our principles. It helps us be impartial. I mean, I've been at this for years, and I know when I'm being pulled, when my buttons are being pressed, as we say. It's hard to be partial. We all have our biases. It's hard to be impartial, but we can also use tools to enhance best practices because we can replicate them. We can understand how they act and respond in different situations. We can counteract our own fallibility. It may not be bias, it may just be mistakes. It fosters comfort for families. When I say to usually a father, no, I'm not recommending overnights right now, but here's a tool that shows you the 3 things you could do, at which case I would feel very comfortable doing that. Here's where you have to get, here's how we do it, and then we can get back. That's much more helpful than something sort of ambiguous. Hey, someday in the future, you'll be able to have your heart's content. It creates efficiency, and most important in this field, it allows transparency. We have such little transparency in the legal world, and we need so much more. In one of the tools and programs I'm going to show you, I interviewed high conflict families and low conflict families to see what their different experience was with the court system. And the thing that struck me so deeply was one father talking about feeling like he had entered a Nazi situation where he's asked to wait outside while other people determine his fate and then bring him in and tell him what's good for him. And I said, you mean the other attorney? And he said, no, I mean my attorney with the other attorney. And I thought, for that to feel that, displacing, that minimizing, we are doing something wrong in the field. So my whole career has been at trying to change that. First thing I'm going to talk about is one way to triage family court services. And this was a model that the Connecticut judiciary created, but it's not on your slide. But I also should say that the model was actually determined by a group of AFCC professionals. And if you don't know AFCC and you work in this field, you should be looking them up. It's the Association of Family and Court Professionals. They are at the cutting edge of so much work in this area. Canada and America work very closely on a board together and doing all kinds of activities and conferences. I think here in Quebec province, there's been less contribution and involvement than the rest of the country, but it's really time for everyone to get involved. This is an example of the kinds of projects that we all get involved in together. So the first thing is the intake screen. Before we created a screen, there was no screening tool, and there were two services available to all families. There was mediation, and there was what we call comprehensive evaluation. After the screen, there was a universal screening. Everybody that contacted the courts went through an immediate screening. And there were 4 available services, which I'll tell you about in a moment. So I'll come back to that. The triage procedures, families enter court and they fill out a questionnaire, which assesses their general information, their level of conflict, their ability to communicate and cooperate, the complexity of their issues. Is there substance abuse? Is there child abuse? Is there domestic violence? And are there mental health issues? Those are the 4 big complexity contributors. What is the level of dangerousness in the family? And probably the quickest, dirtiest tool for figuring out if you're going to get anywhere is how disparate are these 2 parties' stories and the facts, and how much corroboration are you going to need? So that all gets assessed. And I think, by the way, this tool has been adapted and is used in BC as well, but they've made it very much their own. And then a continuum of services is available, because one of the problems with triage tools is we often have great tools, like for figuring out who's depressed or figuring out who's using substances. And then we try and refer them, and there's a 6-month wait to get into services. It's not very useful to triage and have nowhere to go. So they also created this continuum of services, with mediation being the first level of defense, or I should say intervention. And families got up to 6 sessions of mediation, but usually used 2. The next was issue-focused evaluation, which was put in. Not everyone needs a comprehensive evaluation. Maybe they could figure out half their issues, but the other half they couldn't. And so the specific issues were evaluated. And then there was a court resolution conference, which is a cross between mediation negotiation. Families mediated, but when they got stuck, the professional could make decisions for them in terms of recommendations and could guide them in certain directions. And then there was the comprehensive evaluation. So what difference did these 4 categories have? You'll see a control group. I'm saving you the details because we don't have time. I'm happy to fill it in later. But I created the experimental group got these new services and the triage, and the control group did not. So in the past, 62% agreed in mediation. Were given mediation, and 38% were given a comprehensive evaluation. Once we made this change, you'll see a huge drop in mediation that got moved into these 2 interim, slightly higher level programs so that we got more information. It was more finely tuned to the moderate levels of conflict. Interestingly, comprehensive evaluation didn't go down any. In fact, it went up a little bit. So the disposition of all cases. Oops. There we go. Is that agreement rates? Yes. So here's the control group, and there's the experimental group. You'll see that first I looked at the initial service, how much agreement was reached when they were initially given some kind of treatment. Then all services, when they came back for a second and a third. And within mediation itself, look how much more effective mediation was by not just giving everybody mediation. It went from a 67 to a 79% in terms of being able to help families. In general, everything was right around 75%, which is pretty good in terms of unclogging the court dockets. Summary of outcomes. So the single factor that really told us whether someone was going to be high conflict and needed an evaluation was disparity of views. So if you couldn't do this whole thing, if you just got that information, you would know whether you were wasting your time trying to settle it. It almost never settled, and it always wound up in needing an evaluation because we needed more information. When one person was concerned about domestic violence and one not, 88% of the time they wound up in an evaluation. Agreement rates were up 5%. Return rates were cut in half. One of our court's problems, and yours as well, is not people coming in for the first time. It's people coming back and coming back. And the post-litigation rate was cut in half. Fewer quicker returns. How many people came back in less than a month? Fewer child-related motions were filed. That means more money in people's pockets, in the parents' pockets. It means less clogs. It means less attorney wasted effort. Less judges' time was spent regarding child-related motions because there were fewer. And within 3 years, we showed a $400,000 decrease in costs, taking increases in salary into account. So what do you notice about this? High conflict has its own timing. The same number of families, no matter how skilled we got, wound up needing a comprehensive evaluation. About that many that wind up that far in court and don't get help elsewhere need to go through the whole process. So get them there quick and get the information and stop letting time be a factor. And everybody else that you're not sure about, parcel out and get them an appropriate level of help, and it winds up helping everyone, the family, the professionals involved, and most importantly, in this case, for this study, the court. Other outcomes for the vulnerable populations, that is the high conflicts, our never marrieds, and our pro se's, We got more valuable information, and I was able to test that the screen and services were as effective for them and even a little more effective than they were for the general population. So that worry about who's getting help, we were actually able to get the help to where it was needed most. And the screen also was very useful for quality assurance, for knowing what was going on across our different districts, where very different people were working with very different populations, and it was uneven. And that worries me in terms of the quality of justice across our states and our country. But this helped make it more even. I know now would be a normal time for questions, but let me just keep plowing through. I want to show you a totally different model now. And this was a research center, it says research center, but actually it is a resource center. So that was my Freudian slip. It's a resource center for separating and divorcing families. And there's also the Center for Out-of-Court Divorce, and I'll explain these. This is a group, again, that was formed with consultation from AFCC, in this case from myself and Andy Shepard, one of my law colleagues, law professor at Hofstra. And we worked to create the first center where you could get divorce completely outside of the court system. So why did we want a center? Well, in our country, as in yours, about 50 to 70% of divorcing families now are choosing to be self-represented. Many want representation, but they can't afford it. Some can afford it, but along the way they run out of money and they still haven't made sufficient progress. Many people no longer trust the motivations of lawyers. We're having a crisis of confidence. And many people are turning to the internet and other poor sources for advice. So we wanted to get good advice into their hands. The best reason of all to have one of these centers is that parents who are in constant conflict don't provide good role modeling for their children about how to handle challenges in life. They make compromises that allow children to have beneficial relationships with both. They don't plan effectively, and they don't make choices that support their children's ongoing interests and activities. I have kids who live across jurisdictional borders, and they have to do, their soccer on one day when that parent will take them, and their music on that day when the other parent takes them. And if the schedule gets changed, they just don't get taken to the activities because the other parent won't support it just because it was the other parent's choice. In fact, many of my couples can't even agree. One says the children really want to play hockey, and the other parent says, that's not what they tell me. They don't really want to play hockey. So you can't even get that clear. So the best reason to create a center was because parents who don't do this have children who grow up to be in the category of showing repetition, having difficulties that their parents had, more likely to get divorced, less likely to be educated and to do well in their jobs. All of the research comes from these families, not families who work it out. So what are our goals for our center? We wanted to respond to the community need, and we wanted to eventually establish a national model and create a place for training students. One of the things that we decided as a group was that you can't teach old dogs new tricks. There's only so much that those of us who've been in the field for a long time will change. And some of us, those of you here today, are more likely to change than your colleagues who are not here. Right? It's always the ones that we most need to get to these conferences that refuse to come. So we decided the thing to do, just like we know early education is where it's at to get the bang for your buck, to begin getting professionals when they're training, to teach them new ways from the beginning. So these are other reasons. We wanted to provide access to justice, which I know is a big push right now in Quebec. You want to reduce the problems that are associated with divorce and encourage interdisciplinary work. So we created this resource center at the University of Denver. It was based on the Australian relationship centers. If you don't know about those, you should read about them. They're really neat. The one difference is that their federal government funded them, and nothing like that gets funded in the United States. So we had to figure out another way of doing it. We brought together interns from the School of Law, professional psychology, and social work. And we started in the center in September of 2013, and I'm going to be talking about 2 years. And after 2 years, we transitioned to the community because it became financially unsustainable. It would have been sustainable if, as we expected, the university picked it up. But the university said it was too intensive of training for too few people, and it wasn't on their priority list. So we moved it into the community thinking that would be a more sustainable model. The hallmark of RCSDF is that the family's decrees are entered at the university. They never go to court. The judge, a retired judge, comes once a month, he takes off his robe, he sits at a table, he talks to the families, and he works it out with them. There's a video, if you go look on the IALS website, IAALS, the Institute for Advancement of the American Legal System, and they show this. The first family that went through it left going out to lunch together holding hands. That's not how they came in. The judge was beside himself. He was so excited. Okay, what kinds of services did we offer? We started with something that those of you in the field, in the mental health field, may know called discernment therapy, where it's a couples counseling session to help parents decide where they are in working through the relationship. One of the things that makes separation divorce processes so long is that one parent has usually been thinking about it for so long and they're ready to go, and the other parent is surprised and needs a lot more time. And so rather than wasting time having mediations that go nowhere because the person's just not emotionally ready, we started by having counseling sessions to decide if they're ready to move forward. A really simple, sensical idea, we thought. Then they move on to mediation, which was done by a law student and a mental health student together. And by the way, all of this was very, very carefully supervised. I did not think students should work with high conflict families. I think it's problematic. But we had one lawyer, one social worker, and one psychologist part-time on staff who were like literally in the room with the students and picking up the slack and really training them in a super intensive hands-on way. It was fabulous training. It was expensive training. You can decide the pluses and minuses of that. But the students who got it all went out and got amazing jobs because they had great experience that their colleagues coming out of law school or mental health programs didn't. But anyway, it's not perfect, but those are the decisions that we made. And while the mediation was going on, the lawyer was right there with them and picking up so that no balls were dropped. We had legal education. Every family had to start by hearing what their options were for different ways of getting things done. They heard about parenting education. They basically got information up front. And then we interviewed all children over the age of 4. And we interviewed them not about what they wanted, but about what they thought they were doing there, what was happening to their family, and what they wanted to say, so that every child had a chance to say something. Amazing what a difference it made. Instead of fighting between mom saying kid wants hockey and dad says kid doesn't want hockey, the kid would come in and say, all I want is to live where I can play hockey. Or, oh, I don't care about hockey. I just want them to stop fighting. If the hockey's the problem, it doesn't mean that much to me. But the kid would say things like that up front that we could use and share. And there were many things that we didn't share with parents, but we at least used the information to inform what was happening. Parents loved it, the kids loved it. We then did co-parenting coaching, where we worked on parents learning how to co-parent, and then they were given the chance to do adult one-on-one counseling, child counseling, transition support groups for kids or for parents. And they could do as much or as little. What we loved is that it was this comprehensive thing. What we found out was that very few people wanted to use the counseling services. They want that later. They right now just want to get through this process. And they love having the child piece. They love having the co-parenting counseling. But for real counseling, they're not there yet. So that was interesting because that was a costly piece of this that we could do later. But it also cost us the model a little bit because it was hard to get enough hours for the psychology students to fill their requirements. So we were able to restructure that. I don't have time to talk about how we did that, but again, I'm just sharing the good, the bad, and the ugly of all this. Children did like coming to workshops, like little one-time or two-time things where they learned they drew and talked about their feelings and learned that other kids had the same feelings and got to compare what it was that they were doing. Okay, so here was our process: intake, screening, service planning meeting, service provision, permanent orders, and then ongoing support. They could come back. And I won't go through all the stuff. You can read it later, but that was basically the process. Who came to the center was interesting. Everybody who came early in the process. We got moderate and low-level conflict people. It was designed for also high conflict, but we didn't get as many high conflict people. I'll explain in a little bit. We got all income levels, but mostly highly educated people. Turns out those who are willing to take their chances with students are those who were graduate students themselves and knew what a good process it was. And those who weren't didn't trust the process as much. The other thing that was really important is nearly half of the families came because their children had special needs, and they needed more than they could afford or could deal with in the regular court system. So it was a chance to catch a very vulnerable subset of our population. We then moved after 2 years, we moved into the community, and that's where it is now. And it's less student-focused. Students are back in intern roles instead of primary presenting roles. And there are pluses and minuses of that I can talk about. But what I want to share most is where I live in Massachusetts, we don't have a donor like DU, the Denver University. We don't have that kind of money. We are a small group. I'm not in Boston. I'm in the western part of the state, the Trois Rivières of Massachusetts. And we do everything together. We're real collaborative, but we don't have much money, but we're really educated and really enthusiastic. So taking that model, I worked with my group saying, we have to do this in the courts. What I think went wrong, if went wrong is fair, is that we're ahead of our time. People are scared to take this outside the courts because their lawyers and their mothers were saying to them, what if, you do this nice collaborative process and you're giving up the chance to fight for your extra time, or what, everybody wants to cover their butts in the worst case scenario. And that's the advice they were getting. So we said, how could we take this in the courts? So our judge, Linda Fidnick, an amazing judge from AFCC, who we started something that we called the Family Resolution Specialty Court. And first we got an advisory committee together from the whole community. It started at 20, we're up to 30 people who meet regularly. It was started as a voluntary program. The judge provided oversight. We had a family consultant that we now have hired, but for a year we did it as volunteers, who does the case management, facilitates the process, and provides mental health consultation along the way to families. We included our probate court, which did an intake, and they had the court connection when we got stuck and bogged down. So we had power in the court as well as outside. Every child was appointed an attorney from the beginning, and informal rules of evidence were used. We got rid of all the formal court stuff, and the judge would sit down with the family, and things were moved along quicker. And as we went, we could make partial judgments, so we could make progress along the way. This is what this process looked like. And just to compare it to the Denver one, so you have, I don't have to go through it, but this tells you sort of the order, again, that we went through the process. And you'll see there are many things similar because I was consulting in both directions to both projects, but we made changes based on who our community was. And my last slide is, okay, so what do all these programs have in common? First of all, we use a broad definition of conflict with room for individual determinations. So we tried to pinpoint where the conflict was, what type of conflict it was, using all the kinds of instruments I talked about. But then we used a very fluid definition. We always use interdisciplinary team approaches, whether it's in the court or outside the court, and we use specialized and coordinated service provision, which just makes sense these days. It was closer to the community. Every kind of intervention stays as close to the community as we can. It involves training for new as well as experienced professionals. I think we have to get the new professionals, but they have to work in a mentored way with experienced professionals, and both sides love this. We have to focus on early intervention, which means mental health is valued. It's a chance for a public health focus on divorce, and it's child-focused. And education is provided to everyone, the parents, the professionals. Everybody is learning better strategies for conflict resolution. If you want to learn more, here are some articles to read. And right on time. I'm ready for questions. It is a great question. The main problem, I think, with the DU model that they encountered was that there was always one parent willing to be part of it. But it was hard to get the second parent to be part. Massachusetts had an easier time doing that because it was in the court system. So we could use what was called the shadow of the law to induce people to participate. But none of these programs get at the, families still can just say no. What we hope and what we found is that if they say no long enough, and if they start running up against their money being running out and their kids looking bad, then they're willing to come back. What we're always working on is how to get them sooner. And I think that actually having one foot in and one foot out of the legal system has given us the best opportunity to do that. But in terms of are there ways, I think your question was also, are there ways to convince the other parent? Probably nothing you haven't tried. I sit down with the reluctant parent if I can get them to talk to me, and I use a combination of, practical, common sense information and research. Research is very compelling to people. And if you know the research about what happens to kids in high conflict situations, what happens to kids in divorce situations that drag on, what happens to fathers who are involved with their kids in a positive way, and what happens to the mothers, and what happens to the kids in those families versus those where dads are not involved, what happens to children's attachment, et cetera, et cetera. If you have little blurbs about that, it really affects people's thinking. But that and then the combination of leaning on them saying, you don't want this to have to happen, and having a judge who says to the family, this has been the most effective, meeting with a judge who says, look, I can tell you what's going to happen to your family. I don't know them. I'm going to just make a choice, and it may be good and it may be bad, or you can keep control and you can work with me on it. Those are your two options. Except for the most compromised people, when you tell them that they get control and that the judge is telling them she's not playing, because one reason people stay in the legal system so long is because of what I call the Wizard of Oz factor. You all know the Wizard of Oz? I hope. Dorothy kept going and going and going because at the end was this fantasy of the wizard who was going to fix it. And even as she went, she kept believing that the wizard was the one with all the answers. And the wizard turns out to be this little bah humbug guy that she could have saved a lot of trouble. So one thing I've learned is bring the judge in early. Let the people see the judge and don't keep the fantasy going that either the judge or the lawyer are going to come save them. As long as you let that fantasy fester, they say no. But when you take that fantasy away, you get a much higher uptake. Even if your judge is little and bald and short and scared. That's a different story. When you do an intake, as soon as you smell and really understand that there's alienation going on, these other models aren't helpful. You then have to move very quickly to a model that has a number of stages of enforced behavior with accountability. A lot of people have written about that. Jen Johnston, Nick Birnbaum, I think Barbara Fidler. There's a number of alienation models, but those require some oversight. In those cases, without having an imposed institutional superego, you don't get change. And if it goes too far, as sad as it is, it often can't be undone without years of change and when the child is actually away from the alienating parent. What this model sometimes does is catch that process before it starts. But if it's already in play, go right for the evaluation and go right for the legal accountability. I'm not sure why they're in mediation if it's gotten to a point where the child is at such risk. At that point, I think that the mediation should simply be about what kinds of protections to put into place, and the protection of the child comes first. So once it's deteriorated to that level, usually you can't have both parents have unsupervised involvement with the child. and the child's protection comes first. So the mediation should only be to support that. The parents' interests no longer have any precedence. It sounds harsh, but that's exactly how I feel. Is that? You're looking like I didn't answer. What else do you need?
For me, it's mostly like the collaboration between the two interveners. Like if you'd have a recommendation for that in the context where we really want to make sure that to the parents' eyes, the mediator would be neutral for them. So for sure, to youth protection services intervener, the priority, and as well for the mediator, the protection of the child for sure is the main concern and at the heart of their reflection and decision.
Okay. So if you're asking about the collaboration between them, in the Massachusetts model, that's what we call the family consultant. In the Denver model, we have a similar role. Somebody is given a case management role, and their job is to bring everyone together. We do it in education. We do it in medicine. We do it in every other area. Somebody needs to bring everybody to the table and to be the responsible case manager. And if you don't have anyone else in that role, then you can either have a court appointee in that role. If you have, the mediator could take that role, but ideally, if they're maintaining their neutrality, then you need somebody else appointed, either by the court, agreed to by the parents. A parenting coordinator can be in that role. So there's a number of people who can, but you need somebody who is talking to everyone, who is informing everyone, and whose job it is to bring those two together.
With a systemic thinking approach.
Yes, with a systems thinking approach. It has to be someone who understands how these things get triangulated and split, and the person needs to be able to stop that from happening, because then both of the other institutions have the best chance of doing what they do well.
Alors, il nous reste du temps pour une petite question et une petite réponse, ou une grande question et une petite réponse. Est-ce que quelqu'un a une petite question? Ça va, de toute façon, Marsha reste disponible à la pause, elle est prête à en parler sur l'heure du dîner. Donc, Marsha, merci beaucoup.